the end of the Middle Ages, a mighty nation arose on the borderlands between Europe and Asia. A land called Russia. A dynasty of Viking princes would lift Russia to greatness. The greatest of their line, Tsar Ivan the Terrible, would cast Russia into chaos. Out of the ashes would rise a giant, a new Russian empire, and the man who created it, sailor, soldier, carpenter, Tsar, Peter the Great. For decades, Tsar Ivan the Terrible had held Russia together with the force of will and fear. Then, in 1584, Ivan died. His reign of terror was over, but the chaos had only just begun. The Russians themselves would call the early 1600s Smutnoye Vremya, the time of troubles.
Time of troubles was really a very traumatic and disastrous time.
The country has gone through terrible upheavals in the terror.
Famine, disease, all of these things. So everything that could go wrong did go wrong.
It's a disaster. It's a catastrophe. I don't think there's any other way to explain it.
A vicious cycle of hardship spread chaos and despair across the land. To survive, peasants ate grass, bark. Some records claimed they even turned to cannibalism. Russia's rulers fared little better. Fyodor Ivanich, Boris Godunov, Fyodor Godunov, Vasily Shuisky. Between 1598 and 1610, 6 different men claimed the title Tsar, only to die or be deposed. The Kremlin grew so shaky, the throne fell prey to an outright impostor. The pretender came from Poland, claiming to be Tsar Ivan's long-lost heir. The charlatan wore the crown for a year before he was exposed and sent home, Russian style. The Russians killed him, burned his corpse, stuffed his ashes in a cannon, pointed it at Poland, and lit the fuse. After that, things only got worse. In the south, Tatar raids and peasant revolts shattered Moscow's authority. In the north, Sweden, the greatest military power of the day, invaded from the Baltic coast. Then, the Poles flooded across the border. Their armies drove deep into the Russian heartland. In 1610, they captured Moscow. The King of Poland stood poised to add the throne of the Tsars to his dominions. Russia was on the brink of obliteration.
There's a real possibility that a Pole will sit on the Russian throne. And that, I think, more than anything, stirs nationwide revolt.
In the dungeon of the Kremlin, the Poles imprisoned Russia's last national authority, the Patriarch of the Orthodox Church. Not far from death, the Patriarch issued a desperate plea. He begged the Russian people to rise up and save their motherland. Noblemen and peasants alike heard the call and banded together. A national militia arose to retake Moscow. After 2 years of fighting and blood sacrifice, the improvised Russian army liberated Moscow from the Poles. Victorious in saving their capital, the Russian people knew, now more than ever, they needed a Tsar to survive. The militia's leader, Dmitry Pozharsky.
Without a sovereign, how can we defend ourselves against our common enemies, the Poles, the Swedes, and Russian rogues who stir up strife?
Nobles, merchants, warriors, priests, they assembled to choose a new Tsar. They sought divine authority, a devout Orthodox monarch with blood ties to Ivan the Terrible. In a monastery far from Moscow, they tracked down a distant relative of Tsar Ivan's first wife, a 16-year-old boy, Mikhail Fyodorovich Romanov. Young Michael at first refused the crown, then bowed to pressure and ambition. July 1613, Mikhail Romanov was crowned Grand Prince of Moscow, autocrat and Tsar of all the Russias. It was the birth of 3 centuries of Romanov family rule.
Any dynasty which survives 300 years is successful. You know, this is one of the great European dynastic regimes, one of the great European families.
The Romanovs spawned a whole series of Tsars and Tsarinas who reformed Russia, who brought Russia into the modern world, who made of her a world power.
Under the first 2 Tsars of the new Romanov dynasty, Moscow began to reassert control over Russia and her people. Any nobleman who dared challenge central authority faced exile or the loss of his lands. In return for their loyalty, the nobles were soon awarded unprecedented control over the peasants who worked their fields. The chaotic time of troubles had opened a window for the peasants. For years, they walked away from lands, debts, and landlords. The exodus crippled farms across Russia and destroyed the nation's economy. Moscow's solution? Serfdom.
And what serfdom really is in the law code of 1649 is to give any landholder unlimited time to find and return a runaway peasant. And that is, from that point onwards, it's understood that a peasant on these estates is to be considered a serf.
Free Russians had been made serfs, slaves, the legal property of the nobles who owned the land. The new law bound peasants, their children, and their children's children to the fields for life. Serfdom, the enslavement of their own people, would haunt the empire and the Romanov dynasty until its demise. The second Romanov Tsar, Alexis Mikhailovich, set other, more promising trends in motion as well. He opened Russia's borders to trade with the West. His armies pushed Russia's eastern border all the way to the Pacific. And even then, Russia's thirst to expand was far from finished.
But it was a kind of drive to the sea. The Russians saw that their fate as a nation was to reach the Pacific Ocean, to go north to the Baltic Sea, to go south to the Black Sea, and that was what they were destined by geography to do.
Russia's thrust for the Black Sea would shape war and peace for centuries. The quest for the Baltic would become the driving obsession of Tsar Alexei's heir, Peter the Great. May 30th, 1672, Moscow erupted in celebration. The Tsar's new wife had given birth to a healthy new prince, a boy who would fall in love with boats and war and ideas and power, a boy called Peter. It was clear young Pyotr Alexeyevich would make a perfect Tsar. The problem was he wasn't the next in line for the throne. Peter's father, Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich, sired 2 families with 2 different wives. Peter's half-brothers, Fyodor and Ivan, were both ahead of him in the succession. But there was one other member of the family determined to break tradition and seize the crown for herself. Peter's half-sister, Sophia.
She was educated beyond what women had usually been educated, and she was a very smart woman. In fact, she was probably the best choice among all the Romanovs to rule Russia well.
At Tsar Alexei's death, Sophia's brother Fyodor took the throne, only to die soon after. Now Peter's family reached for the crown. With the blessing of the church, Peter's uncles prepared to make the 10-year-old boy the new